There is a version of regular show that most people carry around in their heads without ever really looking at it directly, and it is made almost entirely out of the people at the edges of the frame, the ones whose names you would have to pause the episode and think about before you could say them out loud. Not Mordecai, not Rigby, not even Pops or Skips or Benson, the five names anyone would say first if you asked them to describe the show in 10 seconds. I mean the one standing just behind them. The green man on snack bar duty who is technically a giant in his own head, but is actually short and round. The ghost who never gets his high five returned. The unicorns who show up uninvited and leave the place worse than they found it. The goat intern who turns out to be something else entirely. The dead man who has a wife and a 300-year-old son who still needs bedtime stories. Tonight is for them. Tonight we are not talking about the park's cosmology or the war between two brothers born out of the same cosmic source. We already know that story, or we know enough of it to nod along. Tonight we are walking the perimeter of the show, into the rooms Mordecai and Rigby wander through without noticing, and we are going to sit for a long while with the people who live there. Because if you spend enough hours with regular show, you start to understand that the background is not empty. It never was. It is populated in exhausting and loving detail by a production team that could not seem to stop inventing lives for people who were only ever supposed to appear for 11 minutes and then vanish. Some of those lives got only a single scene. A few of them got entire arcs stretched invisibly across years. All of them are still there, waiting in the corners of a show that never once treated its minor characters as scenery. Let's start with the place where most of these background lives actually happen, because it is the most literal edge of the frame there is. The snack bar. It debuted, according to the record, the wiki keeps plainly, in the episode Death Punchies, where it was destroyed almost as soon as it appeared, and then rebuilt by the very next episode as though nothing had happened, which is itself a small piece of the show's grammar. Things break at the park constantly. They come back just as fast. Nobody comments on it. The snack bar is a concession stand with a scatter of chairs and tables near a bank of trash bins, later renamed the Snack Shack during the Christmas special that sends the crew into space. And for most of the show's run, it is staffed, specifically by Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, not Mordecai, not Rigby, not Benson, who runs the whole operation but never seems to actually work the counter himself. It is Muscle Man and Fives who spend their days behind that little stand, selling snacks to a public that, if you think about it for more than a few seconds, must be walking through a park where a talking gumball machine issues shift assignments and a lollipop-headed man occasionally floats past on errands nobody explains to them. There is a small, very specific joke buried in the snack bar's rules that says more about the show's internal logic than its size would suggest. Pops, and only Pops, is allowed to eat the snack bar's food for free. The wiki notes this plainly and even offers a guess as to why. Because he is the son of the park's owner, a fact the show would not confirm outright as fully as it eventually did until years later, when the mansion at the top of the hill and the man who owns everything and the lollipop-headed groundskeeper turned out to be father and son. But long before that reveal landed with its full emotional weight, the show had already quietly encoded the truth into something as small as a snack bar policy. Pops eats for free, everyone else pays. It is exactly the kind of detail that means nothing until it means everything, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because that is how so much of the show's background texture works. It plants a fact in a place too small to notice, and only much later does the fact reveal that it was never actually small. The most complete demonstration of how seriously the show could take its own snack bar policy comes from one of its earliest episodes, Rigby's Body, and it is worth walking through slowly because it is, in miniature, the entire show's philosophy about consequences dressed up as a joke about junk food. Mordecai and Rigby are assigned to work the snack bar. They are bored. Pops mentions, almost as an aside, that he can eat everything for free, and Mordecai and Rigby, hearing what they want to hear rather than what was actually said, decide. This means the snacks are free for everyone. They eat an enormous amount of junk food. The next day, Mordecai has learned his lesson and stops. Rigby has not, and Rigby keeps eating. And the show does something that still sounds strange, described out loud. Rigby eats so much that his body, quite literally, gets up and walks away from him, leaving his consciousness behind as a floating, bodiless presence wandering the park. Skips has to explain the rules of this particular crisis, the way Skips explains the rules of most crises, with the calm of someone who has seen it before and will see it again. Rigby's body must be found and reunited with him before sunset, or he will be stuck this way permanently. It is found. It has been run over by a golf cart in the interim, so Rigby spends the rest of the episode in a full body cast in a wheelchair, and in the show's driest possible punishment, he and Mordecai are told they now have to work the snack bar for 6 months to pay off everything they ate, because it turns out only Pops actually eats for free. The show does not moralize about this. It just lets the debt sit there, mundane and specific, a 6-month sentence handed down for a joke about a technicality. That is the register the snack bar operates in for the whole series. A place where the stakes are always both cosmic in scale and comically small in origin, sometimes in the very same episode, sometimes in the very same sentence. If you want to leave a comment while we're still near the beginning of this, tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like knowing there's a whole map of places this video is quietly playing in, all at slightly different hours, everyone a little further into their own version of tonight. From the snack bar, it is a short walk, in the show's geography and in ours, to the single most disruptive group of background characters the park ever had to deal with, and I mean the unicorns. They arrived in the first season in an episode called The Unicorns Have Got to Go, and the premise, as documented across multiple sources describing the episode, could not be simpler on paper. Mordecai buys a cologne called Dude Time, hoping it will get Margaret's attention. It does not get Margaret's attention. It gets the attention of a pack of unicorns instead, and the unicorns do not leave. What follows is one of the show's most purely chaotic half hours, and it earns that chaos through specificity. These are not generic unicorns. Fan documentation lists 8 of them individually, each with a name and a distinct look, and several were built, quite deliberately, as visual references to real cultural figures. One unicorn wears the unmistakable look of Alex DeLarge from A Clockwork Orange, bowler-adjacent menace and all. Another is modeled on the punk rocker Billy Idol, credited in the show simply as Billy, functioning as something like the group's ringleader. A third resembles the prop-heavy stage comedian Gallagher, mustache and all. This is not incidental costuming. It is the kind of joke that only lands for viewers who already recognize the references layered into a cartoon about groundskeepers, and it tells you something about who was in the writer's room. People old enough to have absorbed those specific cultural touchstones and young enough to still find them funny rather than nostalgic. The plot of the episode turns on Rigby, who finds the unicorns cool in exactly the way a certain kind of person finds obnoxious people cool when he is desperate to be liked by someone louder than himself. He befriends them. He abandons Mordecai to hang out with them instead. The unicorns, in turn, treat Rigby exactly as well as you would expect strangers who fart on people for fun to treat someone currying favor with them, which is to say, badly, and increasingly badly, until Rigby is the butt of every joke at his own party. The episode resolves the way a lot of early regular show episodes resolved, with a drag race, engineered by Skips and Benson as a trap, ending in the unicorns being launched into the sky attached to an exploding vehicle. It is violent in a way that reads as pure slapstick, the kind of ending the show would use again and again in its first couple of seasons before it started reaching for more emotionally complicated stakes. But underneath the slapstick is a genuinely simple, relatable structure. Someone chooses the cooler, meaner friends over the person who actually cares about them and has to eat the consequences of that choice, apologizing through tears once he understands what he did. The unicorns never got real inner lives. They were never meant to. Their entire function was to be a mirror held up to Rigby's worst impulse, dressed as a joke so specific and so strange that decades later people are still making video edits of it, still recognizing the clockwork orange unicorn on sight. That is its own kind of staying power. A background gag so well constructed, it outlived the plot it was built to serve. The show returned to the unicorns more than once, most notably in House Rules, where Benson's expanded list of house regulations explicitly includes a line item banning unicorns from the premises, which tells you plainly that this was never treated as a one-off. It became an institutional memory. The park had a unicorn problem once, badly enough that management wrote a rule about it, the way a real workplace might have a rule about a specific incident nobody talks about anymore except through the rule itself. That is a very particular kind of comedy, the kind where the joke is not the event, but the fact that the event left an administrative trace behind it. Regular Show did this constantly. It let its background chaos calcify into policy. Speaking of chaos calcifying into something with actual staying power, there is no better example in the entire minor character roster than Party Pete. His real name, according to the Wiki's documentation, is Peter Hermann Verfall, and he is almost certainly meant to read as Austrian, judging by his accent, though the character himself is more directly modeled by the animator Calvin Wong's own account on the Europop singer Gunther, best known outside animation circles for the novelty hit Ding Dong Song, which reportedly played often during the episode's production, presumably as reference material for how the character should move and sound. Picture him: shaggy brown hair, golden glasses, a face built around exaggerated cheekbones and full lips, and a single dimple in the chin, a brown mustache, rings on nearly every finger, a white suit with a sequined purple shirt underneath. He looks, in other words, exactly like a nightclub caricature built for maximum comic density, a man engineered from the ground up to be party king. And for a while, that is literally his title in the show's own internal logic. He is the reigning authority on how to throw a good time until his own appetite catches up with him. In his introductory episode, he drinks an enormous quantity of soda, inflates, begins to float, and eventually explodes after the crew, in the show's escalating way, decides the correct response to a man ballooning with carbonation is to feed him even more soda. That would have been a fine, self-contained joke to leave alone. The show did not leave it alone. Party Pete resurfaces in Exit 9B, one of the series' larger crossover-style episodes, not as himself exactly, but as a clone, part of a roster of villains resurrected by Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr. as part of a much bigger plot. It is revealed, in the process, that there is an entire underground party cloning operation running beneath the surface of this show's universe, staffed by people named Vince and Tommy, complete with captive party hosts being held and cloned against their will. Party Pete's actual, non-cloned self is found and freed alongside two other kidnapped party hosts in that operation. This is, on its face, a deeply strange piece of continuity to bother building for a character whose entire first appearance existed to set up a soda explosion punchline. But Regular Show did this kind of thing constantly, and it is worth sitting with why. There is something almost touching about a production team that could have simply let Party Pete disappear after his introduction, the way 100 other one-episode gag characters across 100 other cartoons quietly do, and instead chose to give him a returning storyline involving captivity and cloning and eventual freedom, followed later by a small character beat where, having survived all of it, he tries to walk away from being party king altogether. In a later appearance, documented on the wiki, Pete, now going by his real name, tells Mordecai he no longer wants the crown, that he would rather try to finish a Sudoku puzzle than throw another party, because by then, someone else, Benson himself, has taken up the role of the person who makes celebrations happen. It is a strange, small, almost wise moment for a character built out of a Europop novelty song, and it captures something true about how the show handled even its most disposable-seeming inventions. Nobody, in the world of Regular Show, gets to stay a punchline forever if the writers can help it. Everyone eventually gets a beat where they are allowed to be a person. There is a piece of trivia attached to Party Pete that is worth mentioning because it says something about how self-aware the show's creative team was about its own overlaps with its sister series. Adventure Time, which aired on the same network around the same time and shared some creative connective tissue, has its own soda-loving party character named Party Pat, and according to creator JG, Quintel's own account, the resemblance was coincidental. Quintel has said he had never heard of Party Pat until someone pointed out the similarity to him afterward, and that Party Pat's name was actually a reference to Adventure Time's creative director, Patrick McHale, rather than any deliberate echo of Party Pete. Whether or not you find that coincidence entirely convincing is up to you, and I will label it plainly. This is one of those small pieces of animation industry trivia where two different shows, made by different but overlapping circles of artists working at the same studio in the same years, arrived independently at a strikingly similar type of character. It happens. Cartoons of that era, especially at that particular network, were absorbing a lot of the same cultural water. Now we go somewhere heavier, into the order of beings that gave one of the show's central characters his immortality in the first place, because their story is one of the show's most carefully constructed pieces of background mythology, and almost none of the weight of it falls on the person you would expect. I mean the guardians of eternal youth. Formally, the wiki records their original title as the Immortal Student Council, which already tells you something wonderfully specific about how this show's writers thought. Even its cosmic overseers of immortality started their existence as a school organization. They appear as 5 extremely large, chubby babies, dressed in gold hats, brown bibs, and something that looks like a diaper but which the characters themselves insist is not a diaper, each speaking in a deep, mature voice that clashes entirely with their infant appearance. Their leader, revealed by name only in the episode Quips, is called Reginald. The others, whose names surface later, in the credits of Skip's story, are Oswald, Boswald, and Griswold. There was a fifth, Archibald, who died in fists of justice after a battle with a figure named Clorgbane the Destroyer, meaning that by the time the show's later seasons roll around, this order of cosmic beings has already, quietly, suffered a casualty. Nobody makes a great deal of noise about it. Archibald is simply gone, the way things in this show's mythology are often simply gone, absorbed into the background record rather than mourned on screen. The reason any of this touches Skips at all traces back to his origin story, and it is worth restating plainly here because it recontextualizes almost everything about how these guardians behave toward him for the rest of the series. According to Skip's story, Skips, known then by his birth name Walks, attended the same high school as the Guardians and their associate Gary. Under an organization the show calls the Immortal Student Government and Glee Club, Clorgbane, established as a brother to the Guardians, wanted in on that group and was refused, seemingly because of his own violent tendencies, and the resulting grudge led to a fight that the Guardians and Gary helped engineer weapons for, the Fists of Justice, built specifically to be powerful enough to defeat Clorgbane. During that original confrontation, Clorgbane killed Walks's girlfriend, Mona, and it was in the aftermath of that loss, the show establishes, that the Guardians granted Walks his immortality so that he could properly fight back. He won. He did not kill Clorgbane. He sent him hurtling into orbit instead, which, if you have ever wondered why villains in animated shows so rarely stay dead, is as good an explanation as any. Regular show's cosmology seems to specifically favor exile over execution, at least for its earlier antagonists. What makes the Guardians of Eternal Youth interesting as background lore, rather than simply as an origin story footnote, is how casually cruel their relationship with Skips remains for the rest of the show, layered underneath a comic tone that keeps the cruelty from ever landing as genuinely dark. In Free Cake, which is ostensibly a light-hearted episode about Mordecai and Rigby throwing Skips a surprise birthday party, it is revealed that Skips must perform a specific ceremonial dance every year on his birthday in order to retain his immortality, a private ritual the Guardians require of him in exchange for the gift they gave him centuries earlier. When Rigby's surprise party accidentally interrupts the ritual, the Guardians, through their messenger Gary, arrive to inform Skips that, because the dance was not completed, he is now condemned. Gary, despite being established as a friend of Skips since their school days, tells him this is simply him doing his job, and does not stop the process on Skips's behalf even as Skips pleads with him. That detail is worth sitting with for a second. This is not a villain delivering a threat. This is a friend, informed by an institutional obligation, choosing the obligation over the friendship, at least until the situation is somehow resolved. It is one of the more quietly unsettling relationships in the show's supporting cast, precisely because nobody involved is written as malicious. They are simply bureaucratic, in the specific sense that they follow rules that happen to carry mortal consequences, the same way a real institution might enforce a policy that ruins somebody's week without anyone individually intending harm. The Guardians pop up across the show in ways that range from cosmically significant to almost absurdly minor. In Skip Strikes, Reginald joins a bowling team called the Magical Elements and is caught cheating using magic against Skip's own team, which tells you these beings, for all their cosmic authority, are not above pettiness in a recreational league bowling match. In Quips, a joke-telling character named Quentin Q, Quippinger tells so many bad jokes during a game that Reginald grows enraged and imprisons him, and skips along with him inside a shrinking cube of a prison, a punishment so disproportionate to the crime of being unfunny that it becomes its own kind of joke about how these guardians wield genuinely terrifying power over the smallest possible offenses. In Dodge This, several of the Guardians join a dodgeball team alongside a character called the God of Basketball, another piece of throwaway cosmic mythology the show never bothers to explain further. Because at some point, regular show simply stopped explaining its own pantheon and trusted the audience to accept that yes, there is apparently a God of basketball, and no, we are not going to discuss his backstory. By the time of the show's finale, the Guardians appear again, fighting alongside the park crew in the battle against Anti-Pops, their earlier pettiness folded quietly back into genuine heroism when the stakes finally became large enough to demand it. Gary himself deserves a slower look because his relationship to Skips carries an emotional undertone that the show mostly plays for laughs, but occasionally lets slip into something closer to real ambivalence. Gary, whose full name is eventually given as Gareth, is documented as the king of the planet Synthos, an immortal synthesian who serves as chauffeur and close associate to the Guardians of Eternal Youth, and who drives a flying El Camino to reach the floating oasis where they live. He and Skips share a history that predates the show entirely, going back to their shared high school years, and the show treats that friendship as genuine even while showing Gary willing, at least once, to escort Skips toward execution because it was, in his own words, just doing his job. Later material fills in more of his backstory. In Gary's synthesizer, it is revealed he has an evil twin brother named David who has been ruling Synthos in his absence, and Gary, in classic regular show fashion, ends up having to defeat that twin to reclaim his own kingdom, with an assist from Mordecai and Rigby, who accidentally caused the whole detour by tampering with his equipment in the first place. It is a strange, almost throwaway piece of science fiction mythology, a whole planet and a whole rival sibling dropped into a single episode and then mostly left there, unexplored further, the way this show so often built entire worlds it had no particular intention of returning to. Let's sit for a while with a family that the show built with unusual tenderness, given how minor its members technically are in the overall cast list. Death's family. Death himself, as a character, made his debut in the Season 2 episode Over the Top, and the show's design for him is worth actually picturing rather than just naming. He is an undead, skeletal figure with slim, greenish-white skin flaps, several of which segment his jaw in a way that gives the visual illusion of a mustache and sideburns, even though there is no actual hair there. He speaks in a strong Cockney accent. He wears a black motorcycle jacket, a torn hoodie, jeans held up with a skull-buckled belt, pointed leather shoes, and, when the mood strikes him, a knapsack and a biker's helmet. His right arm, when the jacket comes off, is shown to be abnormally, comically muscular compared to his ordinary left one, a visual joke that pays off directly in his signature ability. Arm wrestling people for their souls, a game he can lose, and has lost, at least once, to Skips himself, which is how Skips managed to bring Rigby back to life after a fatal accident in that same debut episode. There is a specific visual and tonal reference worth noting here, because multiple sources draw the same comparison independently. Death's overall look, the leather, the biker aesthetic, the skeletal severity, has been repeatedly compared to Lemmy Kilmister, the late lead singer and bassist of the band Motorhead, and once you have that image in your head, it is hard to unsee it. This is a Grim Reaper built, at least in spirit, out of the same visual language as heavy metal album art, wearing his job the way a rock musician wears a persona. For a character explicitly defined as the personification of mortality, Death's family life is drawn with a gentleness that is almost startling in contrast. His wife, introduced in the season 3 episode Dead at 8, is a four-armed being with combed maroon hair, red lipstick, and an evident fondness for getting dressed up for anniversary dinners, which is precisely what she is doing the first time the audience meets her, putting on earrings before a date night with her husband. Their son, Thomas, first appears as the antagonist of that same episode, and he is, by any measure, one of the stranger character designs the show ever committed to fully explaining. A demon-like figure over 300 years old who nonetheless behaves, convincingly, exactly like an infant. He wants stories read to him. He wants cookies. He refuses to go to bed. He is, per the wiki's own comparison, strikingly similar in temperament and visual energy to Stewie Griffin from Family Guy, which tracks the moment you actually watch him in motion. Mordecai and Rigby are roped into babysitting him in exchange for death, agreeing to save Muscle Man's life, and the episode plays out as a home invasion-style horror comedy in miniature, Thomas releasing a soul-sucking death worm on the two of them purely because he finds their suffering entertaining, laughing as it nearly kills them before a falling chandelier accidentally knocks him unconscious just in time for his parents to return home and mistake it for him simply having fallen asleep. It is a small, dark, very funny episode, and it establishes something that recurs across every subsequent Death Family appearance. For all his son's demonic cruelty and his own professional ruthlessness, Death loves his family without any apparent irony. He is shown, across multiple episodes, doting on his wife, worrying about their anniversary, and later even helping Muscle Man secure a family heirloom ring from the underworld, specifically so Muscle Man can propose to Starla, an act of genuine generosity from a character whose entire job is ending other people's lives. There is one small, deliberate piece of naming comedy buried in this family that is worth pulling out because it demonstrates the writer's willingness to set up jokes only the most attentive viewers would ever notice. Thomas, Death's son, shares his name exactly with a completely unrelated character, the goat intern who joins the park staff years later, and the show lampshades this coincidence at least once on screen, acknowledging directly that, yes, there are two Thomases, before the joke resolves itself entirely, because it turns out the goat intern's actual name is not Thomas at all. It is Nikolai. Which brings us, appropriately, to one of the most quietly elaborate identities the show ever built for a character most viewers probably remember, if they remember him at all. As the awkward new guy who got picked on, Nikolai's story unfolds slowly and carefully across several seasons, which is itself worth noting, because most background characters in this show get their entire deal explained in a single episode. Nikolai took years. He debuts in Season 4's premiere, Exit 9B, hired as an intern under the name Thomas, ostensibly there to earn college credit, and for the better part of 2 seasons, he simply is the intern, an anthropomorphic goat, tangent-furred, a little awkward, constantly the target of Muscle Man's pranks, calling home to a mom the show eventually reveals to be a robot programmed with an Italian accent. It is only in the Season 6 special, The Real Thomas, that the show pulls the rug out from under 2 full seasons of a character it had led us believe was simply a shy college kid. Thomas is, in reality, Nikolai, a young goat trained from an early age by the KGB, sent to America by a Russian organization, the Wiki names, in an almost too perfect piece of bureaucratic comedy, MOMM, the Ministry of Meadow Management, whose entire stated purpose is figuring out what makes American parks so much more advanced and prosperous than Russia's own, so that Russia's outdated parks might be improved by studying, infiltrating, and if necessary, seizing this one. Nikolai's mission, in other words, is corporate espionage escalated all the way to international theft of Parkland, disguised for 2 full seasons as an unpaid internship. What makes this reveal land as more than a simple twist is what the show does with it afterward. Nikolai learns, partway through the actual extraction plan, that his superiors intend not merely to relocate the park, but to destroy it outright, using a loophole in Russian-American relations as legal cover. And having spent 2 years being treated, however roughly, as one of the group, having been pranked and bullied, and eventually accepted the way any new hire eventually gets accepted once the hazing runs its course, Nikolai turns on his own handlers. He disables the missile meant to level the place, and by doing so commits treason against the very government that raised and trained him for exactly this mission, and by extension, against the country he was sent to sabotage as well, since saving the park from destruction directly worked against Russian objectives too. He ends up, per the show's own account, a fugitive of both nations, going into hiding, later shown in fan-supplemented material, owning a video store in Montreal that rents nothing but spy movies, a small, dry joke about a man who spent his entire adolescence being trained to become exactly the kind of person those movies are about. There is a piece of direct creator commentary about Nikolai's origin as a character that I want to include here, because it reframes the whole joke of his early appearances in a way that is genuinely moving once you know it. J G F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F F Quintel, discussing why the writers built this character as an intern in the first place, before any of the spy material was conceived, has explained, in his own words, that a great deal of the writing staff had themselves worked as unpaid interns earlier in their careers, and remembered vividly what that experience actually felt like. Not being treated with outright cruelty, necessarily, but going through what he describes as the rounds of getting your chops busted, the low-status probationary period every industry seems to demand of its newest and most disposable workers before it lets them belong. Quintel has said plainly that a lot of people watching those early Thomas episodes did not see them the way the writers intended, missing that the entire comic engine of the character, before any spy twist was bolted onto him, was about what it feels like to be new somewhere and treated accordingly. That is a small, human piece of production history sitting underneath a character most people remember, if at all, as the butt of Muscle Man's jokes, and it is worth knowing, because it changes how those jokes read once you understand what they were actually about. Nikolai's story would have been more than enough material for one background character. The show, characteristically, did not stop there, and gave him a companion piece of mythology in Tecmo, a supporting figure whose entire backstory is compressed into a handful of scattered appearances but whose origin, once assembled, spans literal centuries. Tecmo, voiced by Stephen Blum, first appears in Skips vs. Technology, summoned to help fix a dangerous computer error that turns out to be a virus named Error 220, itself secretly the villain Doom Ma-Geddon in disguise. He is introduced as a green-skinned cyborg technomancer, his body marked by a mechanical eye and a robotic arm, with a mohawk flanked by shaved sides and a torn black jacket bearing a name tag. What the episode reveals through flashback is that Tecmo was once a human being named Samson, who fought, of all things, in the American Revolutionary War, where he lost an arm and had it replaced with a wooden prosthetic, the show's period-appropriate answer to what a cyborg upgrade would have looked like in the 1700s. Somewhere across the intervening centuries, that wooden arm became mechanical, Samson became Tecmo, and a Revolutionary War veteran turned into a specialist called in whenever the park's technology gets possessed by malevolent viruses, which happens with a regularity that would alarm any actual IT department. He becomes possessed by Doom Ma-Geddon himself during that first episode, is freed once the computer housing the virus is destroyed, and goes on to reappear across the show's later seasons, helping fend off resurrected villains in Exit 9B, assisting a past version of Skips in returning safely to his own timeline in a Skips in Time, and turning up in the show's feature film to help battle a weaponized tornado through time. He drives, in a detail that feels almost too on the nose for a character defined by centuries of technological transformation, a DeLorean, the exact model made famous by a different piece of time travel fiction entirely, and the show clearly knows what it is doing by giving him that specific car. Before we get to the strangest of all these threads, I want to stay a little longer in the show's habit of quietly building out entire professions and institutions that exist just to serve a single joke, because there is a pig, and there is a sandwich shop, and there is a sensei, and together they form one of the more bizarrely detailed pieces of minor character mythology in the whole run. Benson, at one point, is given a pet pig named Applesauce, introduced in an episode built around little else besides the fact that Benson now has a pig. That would have been the whole joke, and it very nearly was, except that later material reveals Applesauce has an entire hidden past. His real name is Leroy. There is a tattoo on his right arm, and he apparently used to work in some capacity the show never fully explains, alongside a partner named Harry Roughhouser, who carries a matching tattoo on his own left arm, the two designs forming a complete skull image only when the pair stand arm to arm. The documented account describes Leroy as the brains of that old partnership and Harry as the brawn, until Harry left him behind after being told, apparently accurately, that he was a loose cannon, only to return later to rescue his former partner from jail once Leroy called for help. It is a hard-boiled, buddy crime backstory, complete with a falling out and a redemption grafted quietly onto a pet pig who exists in the show's actual, functioning plot, mostly to sit around being a pig. Nobody watching the original episode needed any of this. The show built it anyway. Harry Roughhouser, it turns out, has his own second life, entirely separate from his history with Leroy, because he later resurfaces as the owner of a Death Quan Du-themed sandwich shop, a dojo diner hybrid that becomes the setting for two separate episodes built around a genuinely unhealthy signature dish called the Death Sandwich, which puts Benson in the hospital after he eats it incorrectly. Harry's own backstory deepens here too. He had a falling out with his own former master, a sensei who apparently tried to kill him during a later attempt to retrieve a cure, and his own current apprentice eventually turns against him as well, driven by resentment over how he had been treated, sneaking in after hours to eat the forbidden Death Kwando sandwich of health, which promptly ruptures his stomach and forces an entire episode built around Mordecai and Rigby, helping him through emergency surgery. This is, once you step back and actually look at the shape of it, a small saga about mentorship, betrayal, and inherited resentment passed down through at least 2 generations of martial arts sandwich artisans, built on top of a joke that started as nothing more than the name of Benson's pig. The show's other running romantic subplot worth pausing on belongs to Benson himself, and it is worth telling in full because it is one of the gentler, more sincerely felt threads running underneath all the show's chaos. During the period when the park comes under the scrutiny of a shadowy research organization called the Dome, built to study the park workers as though they were the subject of some ongoing scientific experiment, Benson meets Pam, one of the Dome's own scientists, in the episode Pam I Am. Their introduction is almost aggressively ordinary for a show built on cosmic stakes. They bump into each other in a hallway, drop their clipboards, apologize too many times, and discover, over the course of an awkward conversation, that they share a specific, mutual, oddly intense love of hot wings. Benson risks getting caught sneaking contraband food past the Dome's own security to bring her some, and their actual first date unfolds inside the facility itself, escalating into an accidental brush with an anti-gravity malfunction that very nearly kills them both. In a sequence, the documentation directly compares to the fizzy lifting drinks scene from the original Willy Wonka film. Dr. Langer, the head of the Dome Project, catches them together afterward and responds by instituting an outright ban on dating between staff and test subjects, which, given that Benson is, at least in the Dome's official framing, one of the test subjects being studied, is a genuinely strange sentence to have to write about a supporting character's love life. The relationship survives anyway, in fits and starts, across several more appearances. It nearly ends for good once the park is launched into space during the show's later seasons, and a long-distance relationship becomes practically impossible to maintain, with Pam telling Benson plainly that her feelings for him were never the problem, only the distance was. But when the park and its surviving staff eventually return to Earth, the show gives Benson and Pam a quiet, earned reunion, and the material describing the show's aftermath states they eventually marry, adopting Applesauce, the pig, along with what is simply described as a variety of cats. It is a small, patient love story, built almost entirely out of a shared appreciation for hot wings and a willingness to sneak contraband food past armed Dome security, and it stands as one of the more sincerely romantic through lines in a show that otherwise spent most of its energy on Mordecai's far more agonized, far more central romantic failures. There is one more resident of the park's daily rhythm worth mentioning here, precisely because he is among the smallest and strangest presences in the entire cast, existing seemingly for a single purpose and executing that purpose with total, wordless commitment. The coffee bean, introduced alongside his own dedicated translator, is documented as wearing nothing but a white headband and a matching pair of underwear, capable of saying exactly one word, that word being coffee, and possessing the frankly alarming ability to squirt hot coffee directly from his nipples and hands whenever the moment calls for it. His translator dressed in a formal green or teal suit jacket, exists purely to interpret this single word vocabulary into something resembling functional sentences for the benefit of everyone else in the scene. It is difficult to find a more perfectly distilled example of the show's specific comic instinct than this pairing, an entity defined entirely by a repeating, escalating gag, given a fully realized professional support system anyway, because apparently even a man who can only say coffee and leaks hot liquid from his body deserved a dedicated translator to help him be properly understood. There is a small, recurring pattern threading through several of these throwaway inventions that is worth naming plainly, because it tells you something about where this show's writers kept finding their material. Rigby, at one point, watches a cheaply made British horror film called Hello Governor, built around a murderous, sentient taxicab, and comes away from it with a genuine, lingering fear of taxis that the show treats as real and ongoing, rather than as a single joke confined to one episode. Elsewhere, an entire episode is built around Mordecai and Rigby attempting to return a mediocre tabletop role-playing board game called The Realm of Darthan to a store, only for that same fictional game to resurface later as the actual source of a magic sword one of the baby ducks pulls out mid-battle during their escalating mecha showdowns, a small continuity thread connecting a throwaway consumer culture joke to the show's most overblown science fiction storyline. This is, in miniature, the show's whole method. Invent a piece of fictional media, however minor, however clearly built as a one-episode gag, and then trust that somewhere down the line, a writer's room 3 seasons later would remember it existed and find a way to make it matter again. Now, for something genuinely stranger, and I want to walk through it slowly because it might be the single, densest, most self-contained piece of world-building minor lore the show ever produced, buried almost entirely inside 2 episodes most casual viewers probably remember, if at all, as the one with the old movie formats. I mean the guardians of obsolete formats and the entire, honestly enormous mythology the show built around outdated media technology. It starts small. Mordecai, Rigby, Muscle Man, and High Five Ghost go to a library looking to rent a Laserdisc player, only to be told none are available. At which point the librarian, a man named Archie, takes them into the basement and reveals that he is, in fact, the archivist, the guardian of the last remaining Laserdisc player on Earth, following the destruction of every other unit by a hostile faction called the Ancient Order of the VHS. Archie hands the crew a Laserdisc. They use it to activate a group of dormant, muscular beings called the Guardians of Obsolete Formats, each one visually built around the housing of a specific piece of outdated media hardware. There is Betamax, whose head resembles a Sony Betamax VCR. There is 8-track, shaped after an 8-track tape player. There is floppy disk. There is reel-to-reel, modeled on an old projection camera. Each of these guardians has distinct powers, though the show establishes early that those powers are almost entirely ineffective against the genuinely dangerous threats waiting further down this particular rabbit hole. The Ancient Order of the VHS attacks, and 8-track is killed in that very first confrontation by an enforcer called the VC Arbitrator, before Archie transforms into a towering golden crystalline form, the Laserdisc Guardian, and single-handedly wipes out the remaining members of the Order. That would have been, on its own, an entirely satisfying, self-contained piece of one-episode absurdity. Outdated technology, personified as warring cosmic factions, resolved neatly by episode's end. The show, again characteristically, refused to let it stay contained. In Format Wars 2, years later in the show's internal chronology, the surviving Guardians have scattered into ordinary civilian life. Betamax works as an auto mechanic. Reel to Reel has taken a job at a restaurant. Floppy Disk is still quietly mourning 8 track. They are pulled back together, alongside Archie, when a new and far more dangerous format enters the picture. DVD, revealed to be Archie's own son, who creates a Wi-Fi powered enforcer named Internet specifically to take revenge on his father for having, in DVD's eyes, discredited his format's legacy. The ensuing battle is genuinely brutal by the standards of a children's cartoon. Betamax, Floppy Disk, and a newly introduced Guardian called Ampex Quadruplex are all killed. Archie himself dies in the fighting, betrayed in the final moment by his own son's creation, Internet, even after father and son appeared to be on the verge of reconciling. By the episode's end, DVD, horrified by what Internet has done and unable to control the very weapon he built, turns against his own creation and helps the surviving heroes defeat it, and the episode closes on an oddly gentle image. DVD, now redeemed, sitting down to watch a movie together with the last surviving original Guardian, reel to reel, and the ghost of his own father, Archie, who lingers on, at peace, to share in the moment. The mythology does not even stop there. A later episode, Meet the Seer, reveals that Archie had a daughter as well. Blu-ray, previously unknown even to DVD, who shares her brother's ability to transform into a crystalline being and speak while doing so. DVD, now upgraded and renamed HD DVD, reunites with his sister to help the park crew battle streaming, described plainly as Internet upgraded into an even more dangerous new form, in a fight that claims the lives of the last surviving Guardians, reel to reel, and a character called Black and White, whose head resembles an old cathode ray tube television. By the time this particular thread of the show's mythology finally exhausts itself, every single one of the 7 originally named Guardians of obsolete formats has died, in battles fought entirely over the ongoing relevance and legacy of outdated home media technology. It is, on reflection, one of the strangest and most oddly moving things the regular show ever built. A multi-generational family saga, complete with a father-son betrayal, a sister nobody knew existed, and an entire extinct order of cosmic guardians. All of it an extended metaphor, whether the writers intended it that specifically or not, for the way technology replaces technology, format by format, until the thing that once felt permanent and essential simply becomes obsolete and is quietly folded into memory. I want to be careful here and mark clearly where documented fact ends and interpretation begins. Everything I have just described about the plot, the deaths, the family relationships, and the character designs is drawn directly from the show's own episodes as recorded on the wiki and in episode guides. The reading of it as a meditation on technological obsolescence and generational legacy is my own interpretation, offered because it is hard to watch that much specific, sustained care poured into a joke about laser discs without wondering if the writers were quietly saying something true about how quickly the things we build our identities around get replaced by the next format and the one after that. Let's step back out into daylight for a moment, because there is a whole layer of background world building in this show that never needed cosmic stakes at all, and it lives instead in the ordinary, sprawling machinery of family. The wiki maintains an entire page dedicated to nothing but the family members of the main cast, and reading through it in full is a strange, oddly moving experience because it reveals just how much effort went into making sure these characters did not spring into existence in a vacuum. Mordecai's parents, William and Hilary, first appear in the Thanksgiving special, established as warm, ordinary, thoroughly supportive people. Hilary, in particular, became something of a running joke across the seasons that followed, an unintentionally embarrassing mother, the kind who keeps a home movie compilation of her son's most humiliating childhood moments, literally titled Morty Moments, and is willing to screen it for any girlfriend he brings home, a habit that reportedly drove more than one of his early relationships toward the exit. Mordecai's extended family reaches further than that, too. An uncle named Steve, introduced in a Halloween special flashback, meets an abrupt and almost absurdly minor death, accidentally knocked into a bowling ball return by young Mordecai. An aunt named Maxine gets her own dedicated episode. None of these people matter to the plot in any grand sense. They exist purely to make Mordecai feel like someone who came from somewhere, rather than a character who simply appeared on screen, fully formed the day the pilot aired. Rigby's family carries more emotional weight, mostly because of his younger brother Don, who first appears in the episode simply titled Don and returns in Bank Shot. Don is, by every measure the show gives us, more conventionally successful than Rigby, an accountant, dependable, the kind of sibling a certain type of parent holds up as the standard the other child failed to meet. The show plays Rigby's jealousy of Don for real comic and emotional material, though it is worth noting plainly, since this show did handle its sibling dynamics with more nuance than the setup initially suggests, that by later appearances Rigby and Don are shown on genuinely good terms, the old resentment mostly resolved rather than left to fester indefinitely. Rigby's father, Sherm, appears alongside William and Hilary in that same Thanksgiving special, rounding out a family unit the show never needed to build in this much detail, but built anyway, because that appears to have simply been the house style. Margaret's family might be the most extravagantly overbuilt of all of them, and I mean that as a genuine compliment to whichever writer decided a single background episode needed this many named relatives. Her father, Frank Smith, is established as a devoted golf enthusiast who used to play mini golf regularly with Margaret when she was a child, a detail sweet enough that the show later uses it as the emotional core of an entirely different episode where Frank helps give Mordecai and Rigby a ride to a singing competition. Her mother, Denise, gets her own mentions. But it is the episode Family Barbecue that truly commits to the bit, introducing an entire extended cast of Margaret's relatives with names like Ricky, Tommy, Marcy, Robbie, Ronnie, Susie, Stacy, Tim, Dave, Bill, Teresa, Kathleen, and Mary Beth, alongside a grandmother named Nana Smith and a grandfather named Grandpappy Jack, plus an unnamed cousin who offers Mordecai a shot at a handshake from Margaret's father if he can win a cannonball diving contest. Almost none of these people appear again. Most of them exist purely to fill out the frame of a single barbecue scene, giving the impression of a sprawling, noisy, entirely ordinary family gathering, the kind where you genuinely cannot remember every cousin's name by the end of the afternoon. That impression, I think, is the entire point. It is world building through sheer numerical density rather than through any individual character's arc, and it works precisely because nobody in the audience is expected to retain any of these names. You are just supposed to feel, for the length of one barbecue, that Margaret comes from somewhere loud and full and real. Eileen's family gets comparatively little screen time, though the show does note her father appearing in a flashback during snow tubing, and her mother receiving a passing mention in Rigby Goes to the Prom. Starla, Muscle Man's eventual wife, gets a fuller treatment. Her father, Herb Gutsman daughter, and her mother, Rose Gutsman daughter, both appear in Fancy Restaurant, with Rose returning silently in a later episode called Last Meal. The surname alone, Gutsman daughter, is a small, specific piece of comic invention, the kind of Icelandic-sounding construction that suggests a writer sat down and decided this particular family needed a name that sounded exactly like that, for reasons the show never explains and does not need to. Starla herself deserves a moment of her own before we move on, because her path into the cast is stranger and more roundabout than most people probably remember. She is introduced first as Muscle Man's ex, and for a stretch of episodes, the show actually pairs her with Mordecai instead, a relationship that never quite takes and eventually dissolves, before she and Muscle Man find their way back to each other and build something that lasts for the rest of the series, culminating in a proposal Muscle Man is only able to make good on because Death himself, in one of the quieter acts of generosity we already touched on tonight, retrieves a family engagement ring from the underworld to help him do it properly. It is a small, easily overlooked detail that a character now remembered mainly as Muscle Man's steady, loyal partner once passed through a completely different pairing first, the kind of narrative false start this show rarely bothered erasing from its own record, content instead to let its characters' romantic histories stay a little messy and a little real. There is one more supporting figure worth pausing on before we start moving toward the close of this particular walk through the park's edges, because he occupies a strange, liminal space in the show's hierarchy of villains and allies. Mr. Maillard's business rival, a large snack vending machine referred to in some documentation simply by a shortened rendering of his name, who runs the competing park next door. He and Benson maintain an ongoing professional rivalry that occasionally escalates into what amounts to open prank warfare between the two parks. Chaos that Muscle Man, of all people, ends up being the one to put a stop to. It is a small, almost throwaway rivalry, the kind that exists mostly to give Benson someone else to be exasperated by besides his own staff. And it is worth mentioning here mainly because it is easy to forget, watching Regular Show, that Benson's park was never presented as the only park in this universe. There was always another one, right next door, run by another vending machine boss, staffed presumably by its own version of Mordecai and Rigby that the show simply chose never to follow. That is a strange, quietly vertiginous thought if you let yourself sit with it. An entire mirror institution existing at the edge of every episode, never explored, never needing to be. Because this show only ever had room to tell you about the one park it actually loved. There is one more piece of mythology I want to walk through before we start closing the gate on the park for the night, because it might be the single most escalated, most self-parodying thread the show ever pulled on, and it started, appropriately, for everything we have discussed tonight, from almost nothing. In the Season 2 episode, A Bunch of Baby Ducks, Mordecai and Rigby find 4 identical yellow ducklings living by the park fountain, apparently orphaned, and the ducklings imprint on the 2 of them immediately. Benson wants them gone. Mordecai and Rigby, after initially agreeing, attempt to surrender the ducks to a pet shelter, only for the ducks to karate chop a dog and knock out a snake in its glass tank during the intake process, which understandably gets them turned away. Deciding to keep the ducks instead, Mordecai and Rigby discover, almost by accident, that the ducklings are remarkably skilled at video games, skilled enough to beat Rigby 3 separate times in a row, a detail that on its own would have made for a perfectly complete, self-contained joke about a raccoon getting outplayed by baby birds. The show, in the specific way we have spent this entire night documenting, did not let it stay that small. The duck's true nature is revealed gradually across several further episodes. They can fuse their 4 small bodies together into a single, towering, combined form. The show eventually names, quite plainly, Hyperduck. When Mordecai and Rigby themselves join that fusion as pilots, the combined entity is called Hyperduck Extreme. From there, across a full storyline that stretches from the earlier episode, A Bunch of Full-Grown Geese, through to its eventual culmination in Brilliant Century Duck Crisis Special, the mythology only compounds. There is a park variant of Hyperduck Extreme that folds in the entire park staff as additional pilots. There is a further upgrade that incorporates the recurring cop characters Carter and Briggs riding inside their own police cruiser as part of the combined mechanism. There is a long-lost teenage brother to the original 4 ducklings, named Andy, whose sudden reappearance powers yet another evolution of the combined form. And at the absolute far end of this escalation sits something called the Hyperduck Kingbreaker White Lightning, achieved, according to the documentation, by fusing with a group of previously antagonistic geese after they discover they themselves had been manipulated by a corporate entity called Playco, wielding a weapon referred to as the Galaxy Blade, described as being pulled from a moon somewhere beyond Jupiter and powerful enough to physically overshadow the scale of the wider cosmos. The whole saga reaches its most self-aware pitch in Brilliant Century Duck Crisis Special, a 30-minute non-holiday special that critics and fan documentation alike single out as one of the strangest half hours the show ever produced, and deliberately so. The premise, on its surface, is almost administratively mundane. Benson orders Mordecai and Rigby to deal with a rampaging cassowary loose in the park. What actually drives the plot, revealed midway through, is that the entire crisis was engineered from the start by a pair of toy company executives from Playco who deliberately set the cassowary loose specifically to force Mordecai and Rigby into calling the baby ducks for help, because the whole point was never the bird. It was getting all the necessary parties in one place at the same time to pressure them into signing a merchandising contract for action figures based on the Hyperduck mecha. The episode plays this out as a full science fiction epic in miniature, complete with a parody anime opening sequence rendered with Japanese lyrics, direct visual homage to the mecha anime Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann in its climactic combination sequence, and a soundtrack and credit style lifted specifically from Cowboy Bebop. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, the episode even cuts away to show a group of children in a focus group, apparently watching this very episode as it airs, commenting on it in real time, a moment of pure structural strangeness that the show never explains and never returns to. By the end, the combined threat of the geese and the cassowary has escalated into something called Moto Goosewary X, an entity capable of trading blows with the Hyperduck on a scale that involves punching through the clouds and continuing the fight in outer space before the whole conflict resolves, more or less, back on Earth, with Benson having thrown himself gleefully into the destruction this time rather than mourning it the way he ordinarily would, simply declaring the entire experience amazing. The baby ducks and their increasingly implausible fusion forms return one final time in the show's actual finale, standing alongside the rest of the assembled park staff and allies in the battle against Antipops, meaning that 4 orphaned ducklings, found by a fountain in Season 2, ultimately fought in the literal war that decided the fate of the universe. I want to be plain about where the factual record ends here. Every stage of this escalation, the names, the episode titles, the specific fusion forms, and their appearance in the finale, is drawn directly from the show's own documented episodes. Reading it back as a single continuous saga, the way I have just done, is simply what happens when you actually lay the individual episodes, end to end, and notice that nobody in the writer's room ever seemed willing to let this particular joke rest. 2 smaller, gentler pieces of the park's institutional life are worth mentioning before we let all of this settle. The first is the white elephant gift exchange, an entire mythological ceremony the show invented seemingly to punish Muscle Man for the accumulated weight of years of pranks against his own coworkers. When the rest of the staff finally attempts to pay him back, they find themselves transported instead to the temple of an actual white elephant, a towering anthropomorphic guardian of the gift exchange ritual, who is documented as being genuinely displeased with the crew for wanting simple revenge rather than understanding the actual spirit of the tradition, which the white elephant explains is meant to be about giving away things you personally dislike, rather than exacting punishment on someone who enjoys pranking you as his own way of having fun. The crew, having violated the sacred terms of the exchange, are sentenced to remain in his temple for eternity, unable to open any of the gifts inside until he offers them a choice: return and make amends, or open one final box, regardless of the consequences. It is a strange, almost fable-like piece of world building, a whole belief system built around the specific etiquette of regifting unwanted presents, treated by the show with the gravity of an actual religious infraction. The second is the Phone Guardians, a group of 5 living objects who protect an entire hidden dimension built around outdated communication technology. A fire burning inside a small wigwam, 2 tin cans connected by a length of string, an answering machine, a message sealed inside a bottle, and a chalkboard, all documented as living together inside an empty universe and united by a shared inability to understand human emotion. They first threatened to erase Mordecai and Rigby from existence entirely after the 2 hack into Margaret's phone in an attempt to delete an embarrassing voicemail. Mordecai accidentally left her, only relenting once Margaret herself intervenes and convinces them the pair have learned their lesson. They later return in a much gentler role, helping Mordecai work up the courage to admit his feelings to CJ. It is worth noting, because the documentation draws the comparison directly, that this entire concept, a council of obsolete communication devices acting as cosmic overseers of phone etiquette, is explicitly built as a reference to the Computer Obsolescence Prevention Society from the Sam and Max game series, which tells you something about the specific, slightly nerdy cultural fluency running underneath even this show's smallest inventions. Between the Phone Guardians and the Guardians of Obsolete formats we walked through earlier, it becomes clear that this was a genuine, recurring structurability for the show's writers. Take a category of technology that has quietly gone extinct, personify every individual piece of it, and then stage a war. There is a version of Benson that most viewers never really get to see, because it only surfaces in a handful of scattered episodes, and it complicates the character in a way that is worth sitting with before we close this out, because it reframes every single instance of him yelling at Mordecai and Rigby across the entire run. In the episode Think Positive, the show finally shows us where Benson actually comes from, and what it shows is a household defined by constant, low-grade arguing, young Benson simply sitting and absorbing it until the moment he wants something as small as salt passed to him at the table, and his own father tells him, plainly, that if he wants it, he needs to yell for it. That is the entire origin of Benson's temper, laid out in one small domestic scene. A boy taught, directly and explicitly, by the person raising him, that yelling is simply the correct and expected mechanism for getting your needs met. Once you know that, the running joke of Benson screaming at his employees stops sounding like a personality quirk invented purely for comic rhythm and starts sounding like something closer to an inherited habit, passed down the way habits like that usually are, quietly from a parent who almost certainly did not intend to hand down anything at all. A separate episode, The Lunch Club, deepens this further, revealing a strained relationship between Benson and his father, built on the father's repeated insistence that Benson had no particular talent and needed to go find himself a real job, a line that lands with real weight once you notice how much of Benson's own adult life has been spent proving, loudly and repeatedly, that he is, in fact, capable of running something. The episode ends on a small, quiet reconciliation, the two of them getting into a car together, Benson's father telling him they should talk more, the kind of ending this show liked to offer its angriest characters. Not a full repair, just an opening. Benson's professional life carries its own scattered history of rivals and losses that rarely get discussed as a connected thread, and it is worth naming them together here, because doing so reveals just how much quiet damage this one character has absorbed across the show's run, while mostly staying, on the surface, the same reliably exasperated middle manager. His very first true antagonist is Susan, introduced in the Season 2 episode Benson Be Gone, after Mr. Maillard, tired of blaming Mordecai and Rigby's chaos on the wrong person, demotes Benson and installs Susan as the park's new manager in his place. She arrives pleasant and organized. She does not stay that way. Once Benson, having been forced to work alongside Mordecai and Rigby as an ordinary staffer, briefly discovers the appeal of slacking off himself and gets fired for it, Susan reveals her true temperament, driving the remaining staff to work themselves into literal transformation, the show depicting this with a genuinely unsettling visual. Mordecai, Rigby, Muscle Man, High Five Ghost, Pops, and Skips slowly taking on Susan's own hairstyle and mannerisms the longer they obey her, becoming clones of her by simple, accumulated compliance. Benson, having in the meantime met a homeless former park manager named Leon, who warns him what a life of pure slacking actually costs a person, decides he wants his old job and his old self back, and returns to break Susan's hold over the staff by ordering them to disobey her, to slack off, to put their feet up on the furniture specifically because it will make her furious. It works. Susan, enraged past the point of maintaining her human disguise, transforms into a towering demon and threatens to kill everyone in sight, at which point Leon, in the show's own account, sacrifices his life, driving Mr. Maillard's limousine directly into her heels, knocking her off balance and sending her falling backward into a fiery pit she does not climb back out of, at least not until a resurrection storyline pulls her and a great many other dispatched villains back into the plot years later. It is genuinely one of the show's darker early episodes, and it is worth remembering that this was Benson's very first fight. The first time the show let him be something other than simply the person who yells at the two main characters. A man who lost his job, lost a version of his own identity to compliance, and watched someone else die, saving him from the consequences of that loss. Benson's second recorded nemesis carries a smaller footprint, but an equally sharp edge. Chong, introduced in Stick Hockey, is documented as having killed Benson's own former apprentice, a character named Dave, a full decade before the events of the episode. During a stick hockey match, Chong won through outright cheating, a habit the show establishes he apparently maintains toward anyone unlucky enough to lose to him, chopping off body parts as some kind of standing penalty for defeat. Benson, given the opportunity a decade later to finally face Chong himself, wins, avenging a friend. The show never once mentions again outside of this single episode, closing a decade-old grudge in the space of 11 minutes and then quietly setting the whole thing back down, never to be picked up again. It is a strange, almost noir-inflected piece of backstory to bolt onto a character otherwise defined by gumball machine middle management comedy, and it exists, as far as anyone can tell, purely because the writers decided Benson deserved a real history of losses and old scores, the same as anybody else who had spent enough years working the same difficult job. I want to close this particular thread on Mr. Maillard himself, not the cosmic weight of what he was protecting by raising Pops, which other conversations about this show have already covered thoroughly, but the small, specific, human shape of what happens to him once that protection is no longer needed. After the finale, once Pops has given himself to the fight he was always going to have, the documented account of the show's aftermath states plainly that Benson becomes Mr. Maillard's caretaker, tending to the very man who spent decades employing, underpaying, and routinely mispronouncing his name out of what the record describes as gratitude for years of steadfast work, and perhaps because Benson had, by then, become the person standing closest to Mr. Maillard, besides the son he lost. Mr. Maillard eventually leaves Benson everything, his possessions and ownership of the park itself. Mordecai, returning from 3 years away with the rest of the crew, is shown at one point simply noticing Mr. Maillard, standing alone, staring up at the sky, grieving quietly, and without any dialogue attached to the moment at all. And in the show's final, most distant timeline, at the 25-year reunion the finale eventually arrives at, Mr. Maillard is already gone, having died sometime before that reunion took place, remembered by a statue the returning staff erect for him standing directly beside the one they built for his son. It is a small, unglamorous ending for a man the show spent years using primarily as a source of comic exasperation, mistaking Benson's name for laughs episode after episode, and it lands as quietly devastating precisely because of how little fanfare the show gives it. He does not get a death scene. He simply is not there anymore by the time the story catches up to that particular stretch of years, and the two statues, standing side by side, say everything the show apparently felt it needed to say about a father who spent his whole life keeping a secret he knew eventually he would have to lose. There are two more institutions worth walking through before we finally let the gates close, because together they show something specific about how far this show was willing to build out an entire bureaucratic apparatus purely in service of a single afternoon's worth of trouble. The first belongs to a shock jock calling himself the Night Owl, a young radio station owner with brown hair and colored sunglasses who, in the season 2 episode simply titled The Night Owl, runs a contest over the airwaves promising a vintage muscle car, specifically a Dodge Challenger, to whichever contestant can outlast everyone else standing on top of a massive billboard. Mordecai, Rigby, Muscle Man, and High Five Ghost team up as the last four standing, and rather than fight over a single prize, they decide, in one of the show's small, easy demonstrations of genuine friendship, to simply share the car between the four of them once they win. The Night Owl, it turns out, wanted a fight, not a friendship, because a dramatic falling out among the contestants was always the actual content he was chasing for his station. When he realizes his last four contestants have no intention of turning on each other, he tricks them into a fight anyway, and then freezes all four of them solid in liquid nitrogen, apparently intending to thaw them out decades later for the pure spectacle and fame it would bring him. The show follows through on this premise with a genuinely unsettling flash forward. The crew wakes up in a future built entirely around their own frozen imprisonment, the Night Owl having become a wealthy, powerful businessman off the back of the stunt, running his own high-tech museum built around the legend of the four men he trapped. They escape, of course, and manage to travel back and prevent the entire contest from ever happening in the first place, which erases that future outright and leaves the Night Owl exactly where he started, a penniless, unremarkable failure with a radio show nobody particularly listens to. It is worth noting, because the show itself treats this as connected material rather than an isolated stunt, that the Night Owl later reappears among an entire assembled legion of past villains resurrected in Exit 9B, standing alongside figures like Susan, Party Pete's clone, and the judge we are about to meet, in what amounts to an entire underworld's worth of grudges being called back into service all at once. That judge is Broseph Chillickston, and his entire existence as a character is built around a single, perfectly absurd legal premise, that there exists, somewhere, an actual courthouse of cool, an intergalactic cool court, complete with its own prosecuting attorney, its own bailiffs, its own stenographer, presided over by an invisible judge in a curled white wig and black sunglasses, whose entire body of law exists to punish people for the crime of being too cool. Mordecai and Rigby are summoned before him in the episode Cool Bikes on precisely that charge, and the trial that follows plays out with the full, straight-faced procedural rhythm of an actual courtroom drama, witnesses called, evidence presented, a prosecuting attorney using underhanded tricks like getting the defendants to place their hands on a book and say the words, "I swear," then presenting that oath itself as evidence of coolness, because swearing, apparently, is inherently cool in the eyes of this particular legal system. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost are brought in as witnesses and offer lukewarm, unhelpful testimony. An employee from a store called Das Coolest testifies that Mordecai and Rigby used to be the most uncool customers imaginable, right up until they single-handedly brought in enormous business, at which point they became unbearably cool by association. And when the defense, in a final desperate move, calls Benson to the stand, hoping his notorious impatience with the two of them might work in their favor, Benson instead states plainly and sincerely that Mordecai and Rigby are the coolest guys he knows, a moment of genuine, if inconvenient, affection that immediately backfires by sealing their conviction. Broseph Chillickston sentences them to death for the crime of excessive coolness. Gary, once again showing up as an ally to characters he has no obligation to help, serves as their defense attorney throughout, and it is Benson himself who ultimately helps engineer their escape, the three of them fleeing through a teleporter while Mordecai throws a bicycle into the mechanism, triggering an explosion that destroys the entire courtship and kills Broseph Chillickston along with everyone else aboard. He, too, resurfaces later among the assembled resurrected villains in Exit 9B, a judge brought back from the dead specifically to continue prosecuting a crime that was never real in the first place. There is something wonderfully specific about a show willing to build an entire invisible judiciary purely to punish two groundskeepers for having, for one afternoon, accidentally become popular at a bike shop, and then to bring that same judiciary back from the grave years later simply because the writers apparently could not resist reassembling every grudge the show had ever accumulated into one final, overstuffed army. There is one more death in this show's background record that deserves to be told slowly and in full, because it might be the single most tender piece of minor character writing the show ever produced, buried inside an episode whose premise sounds, on paper, like pure farce. A man is killed by a bear after hiding a cactus underneath what he believed was a police officer in a bear costume, and his son has to drive across several states to fulfill his dying wish, which is to scatter the ashes of his own hat over a hall of fame for truck drivers. That is Muscle Dad, and the episode built around his death, Trucker Hall of Fame, takes that absurd premise and plays every single beat of it completely straight as a story about grief. It begins on Father's Day. Muscle Man is trying to reach his father over the radio to wish him well, getting nothing back but static, until his older brother John pulls up outside in a truck, visibly shaken, and silently produces their father's own trucker hat, the one that reads World's Greatest Trucker, which is all the explanation needed for Muscle Man to understand exactly what has happened. He drops the radio microphone in slow motion. The show does not rush past this. At the funeral that follows, Muscle Man attempts to deliver a eulogy that begins, almost defiantly, by restating the exact circumstances of his father's death, the cactus, the bear, the costume, before breaking down into a full tantrum, knocking things off tables, kicking over a bucket of water, needing to be physically restrained and calmed by Mordecai and Rigby, who are there specifically because Benson had decided High Five Ghost, for all his lived experience as an actual ghost, simply does not handle this particular kind of loss well, and sent Mordecai and Rigby along instead. Once Muscle Man settles, he tells Mordecai and Rigby, sincerely, that his father might not have been the best prankster who ever lived, but that he was the best trucker there ever was, and that his hat, the object Muscle Man is now carrying in an urn full of its own ashes, was effectively his crown. He resolves to carry out his father's final request himself. On the drive to the actual Trucker Hall of Fame, Muscle Man tells Mordecai and Rigby stories about his father, the pranks they used to run together, a birthday party memory involving a piñata that turns out to be full of live scorpions, laughing the entire time, even as the grief sits visibly underneath every story. It is on this drive that the show delivers one of its plainest, least ironic statements of affection in the entire series. Muscle Man tells the two of them, sincerely, that he considers them close friends, and that the reason he pranks them constantly is simply because that is how he was raised, that pranking is, in his family, indistinguishable from love. Mordecai and Rigby are, in the show's small, cruel joke about the timing of sincerity, both asleep when he says it and never hear it. The trip takes a harder turn when the group stops at a rest area and encounters a group of actual truckers who reveal, cruelly and gleefully, that Muscle Dad was never really a trucker at all. He was a forklift operator and had faked a photograph of himself in a rig for years, specifically so his son would have something to be proud of. Muscle Man, devastated, punches his father's portrait in a rage, only to find a note his father had hidden inside the frame in anticipation of exactly this reaction, explaining that he lied about being a trucker purely to toughen his son up for a world he knew would be harsh, and asking him to go ahead and spread the ashes over the truckers who looked down on people like him anyway, out of a stubborn, protective pride that outlasted his own death. Muscle Man does. He and Mordecai and Rigby fight their way to the top of the Trucker Hall of Fame, pursued the entire way by the same truckers, and by a group of hostile ghost truckers who apparently exist there too, and once the ashes are finally scattered, Muscle Dad himself returns, if only for a moment, riding what the record plainly describes as his forklift, lifting the truckers who tormented his son into the air and making them explode, a small, absurd act of posthumous, protective violence on his son's behalf, before the ghost simply drives off to continue chasing the trucker ghosts elsewhere, leaving Muscle Man, Mordecai, and Rigby to head home. It is worth sitting with how strange and how effective this episode's whole shape actually is. A story about a father who lied to his son for his son's own good, revealed and then defended even after death, delivered through a plot mechanism involving bear maulings and exploding forklift ghosts, and somehow landing, by the end, as one of the more sincerely moving pieces of grief writing this show ever attempted. Muscle Man's brother John, referred to elsewhere as Muscle Bro, appears throughout this episode as the one who delivers the news in the first place, and the wider Sorenstein family record shows him turning up again and again across the series, present at the funeral, helping his brother save a trailer in a later episode, standing by him even when other, angrier moments in the show's later seasons see the wider staff of the park turn against Muscle Man entirely over a much larger prank gone wrong. It is, in other words, an entire small family history of loyalty, embarrassment, grief, and love built underneath a character the show otherwise mostly used for my mom jokes and pratfalls. What I think all of this adds up to, walking back out from the details now, is a specific kind of generosity that a lot of comedies simply do not bother with. It would have been easy and completely unremarkable for regular show to treat its background characters the way most workplace comedies treat background characters, as furniture present to fill a frame, occasionally useful for a punchline, never granted an inner life, because an inner life was never the point of putting them there. Instead, across 8 seasons, this show kept reaching sideways into the snack bar workers and the party-throwing Austrian and the babies who run an immortality bureau and the goat intern who turned out to be a defected spy and the cyborg who fought in a war 200 years before the show began. And it kept deciding, apparently as a matter of house policy, that these people deserved more explanation than the plot strictly required of them. None of this changes the shape of the show's main story. Mordecai still grows up. Pop still gives himself to a fight he did not choose. The park still comes home. But underneath all of that, quietly, patiently, a much larger population was being built the entire time, most of whom never got their names said out loud by anyone who mattered to the plot, and all of whom were nonetheless drawn, voiced, and given specific, sometimes genuinely moving inner lives by people who could have gotten away with doing far less. Think about the actual shape of what we walked through tonight. A pig with a criminal past standing next to a sandwich shop built entirely around a martial art invented for the sole purpose of selling an unhealthy sandwich. A scientist in a research dome falling in love with a gumball machine over a shared, specific craving for hot wings, in a romance that survives a demotion, an accidental brush with an anti gravity machine, an institutional dating ban, and eventually an entire departure into outer space, only to be quietly, patiently rebuilt once everyone finally comes home. Four ducklings found beside a fountain who end up piloting a mecha powerful enough to fight in outer space, joined eventually by their own long lost brother and an army of reformed geese in an escalation so complete that by the time the finale arrives, nobody in the audience even blinks at seeing them stand shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the park's assembled defenders. An entire cosmic judiciary built to punish two groundskeepers for the crime of accidentally becoming popular. A father who lied about his own job for decades purely so his son could have something to be proud of, defended even after death by a ghost riding a forklift. None of these threads were ever going to carry the emotional center of this show. That job belonged, and always would belong, to the two friends at the middle of it, and to the family they built around themselves, without ever quite noticing they were doing it. But every one of these smaller threads got built with the same seriousness anyway, stitched into episodes that most viewers watched once, laughed at, and moved past, never suspecting how much quiet, patient invention had gone into making sure that even the disposable-seeming characters had somewhere they came from and something they were still carrying. I think that is worth something. I think a show willing to spend this much care on a background gag about 8 distinct unicorns, on a family drama between warring formats of home video, on the quiet dignity of letting a Europop party king retire into a life of Sudoku, is a show that fundamentally believed the world it was building deserved to feel inhabited rather than merely populated. There is a specific kind of respect in that choice, the same respect you might extend to a real place you have spent a long time in, where you eventually learn the names of people who were never going to be your close friends, simply because you passed them often enough to want to know who they were. Most of what we talked about tonight will never come up in a highlight reel. Nobody is making a 10-minute video essay about Tecmo's arm or about the specific comic timing of a man who can only say the word coffee. But it is there if you look, waiting the way all the best background details wait, patient and unbothered, for someone willing to slow down enough to actually notice it. The same way the park itself is always still there, in reruns and in memory, waiting for whoever wants to walk back through it one more time. Think, for a moment, about how strange it actually is that any of this got made at all. A cyborg technomancer who fought redcoats. A demon toddler who still wants his stories read to him before bed. A retired party king who would rather finish a Sudoku puzzle than throw one more celebration. None of it was necessary. The show would have worked perfectly well, would have made every one of its main characters land exactly as hard, without any of the background material we spent tonight inside of. Mordecai's growth does not depend on whether you know Tecmo used to be a revolutionary war veteran named Samson. Pops's sacrifice does not depend on whether you ever learn that his own father quietly grieved him alone under a night sky before dying off-screen sometime in the years that followed. And yet it is all there, fully formed, waiting exactly where the writers left it. Decades of small, specific, loving invention poured into people who most viewers will only ever glimpse once. in the corner of a single frame before the plot moves on without them. That excess, that willingness to build far more than the story technically required, is its own kind of tenderness. It says something about what this show believed its own world deserved. That is where I want to leave you tonight. Somewhere in that park, right now, in the version of it that exists in your head, Muscle Man and High Five Ghost are still standing behind the snack bar counter, waiting for a customer who might or might not know that only one specific lollipop-headed man in this entire universe gets to eat for free. Somewhere else, a laser disc is sitting quietly in a locked room, waiting for nobody in particular, its guardians long since scattered into whatever comes after this kind of story ends. And somewhere further out past all of that, past the edges even background characters occupy, a goat who was once trained to steal an entire park for a foreign government is sitting behind the counter of a small video store in Montreal, renting out spy movies to whoever walks in, saying nothing about who he used to be. Think about the sound the park makes when nobody important is watching. A soda machine humming behind a snack bar counter nobody remembers being built twice. A radio somewhere playing static because a man once faked being a trucker for 30 years just so his son would look at him a certain way. A laser disc, unwatched, sitting in a locked room that used to matter enormously to 7 beings who are all gone now. None of it down the hist to notice it for it to have happened, and none of it was ever waiting on your attention to become real. That is, I think, the quiet lesson underneath all of tonight's wandering through the edges of somebody else's finished, patient world. The background does not perform for you, and it never asked to. It simply persists, fully formed, whether or not anyone ever stops long enough to look, the same way a park keeps standing quietly through a winter nobody is visiting it in. If you liked spending this much time in the corners of a show most people only remember from the middle of the frame, go ahead and subscribe and let the algorithm know you want more of this. It really does help the channel keep finding the people who want exactly this kind of night. I'll see you in the next one.